Most people try to understand the world by breaking it into parts. We separate things to examine their details, thinking that by understanding the pieces, we'll grasp the whole. But there's an approach in psychology that suggests something different. It proposes that the whole is not just the sum of its parts. This is the central idea behind Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology is a theory of mind that looks at how people perceive and experience objects and situations as unified wholes. The word Gestalt is a German term that roughly translates to form or shape. But it refers not just to physical shape. It's about the structure of experience, the patterns we see, and the way our mind organizes information. This approach was developed in the early 20th century by psychologists like Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Köhler, and Kurt Koffka, who challenged the idea that mental processes could be understood solely by analyzing individual components. Imagine you're listening to a melody. If you were to isolate each note, it would lose meaning. A melody is not just a series of notes. It's the relationship between the notes, the rhythm, the pattern that forms a cohesive experience. This is how Gestalt psychologists see perception. We don't just perceive isolated elements. We perceive structured wholes, and our brains are wired to find that structure even when it's not fully there. This perspective becomes even clearer when we look at how humans recognize patterns. When you see a few lines forming a triangle, your brain quickly fills in the gaps, completing the shape even if parts are missing. This is not a conscious decision. It's an automatic, built-in tendency of the mind to organize visual input into familiar forms. That's why we often see shapes, faces, or figures in clouds, rock formations, or ink blots. The mind seeks structure, and it often imposes order even when the input is ambiguous or incomplete. One of the important contributions of Gestalt psychology is the set of principles that describe how this mental organization works. These principles explain how our brains group visual elements together to make sense of what we see. For example, the principle of proximity suggests that we perceive objects that are close to each other as belonging to the same group. If you see a cluster of dots, your brain naturally groups nearby dots together. Another principle is similarity. Elements that look alike are perceived as part of the same form or group, even if they're not close together. There's also the principle of continuity, where the mind follows a path or direction, perceiving lines or curves as flowing in a consistent manner rather than as disjointed segments. These principles don't just apply to vision, they reflect a general pattern in human thinking. Our brains are constantly trying to simplify, organize, and interpret the world in meaningful ways. When we talk to someone, we don't focus on individual words in isolation. We understand sentences, ideas, and intentions. Our minds connect the dots, so to speak, across various domains, whether we're making sense of a visual scene, a conversation, or even a problem. A good example of Gestalt thinking in everyday life is when we're faced with a puzzle. If you've ever looked at a jigsaw puzzle piece, you know that it doesn't make much sense on its own. But when placed in the context of the whole picture, its function becomes clear. Our minds work the same way in perception. We interpret individual elements based on their role in the overall pattern. The details matter, but only in context. Isolated, they might be confusing. In structure, they become clear. This way of thinking also applies to human behavior and relationships. Gestalt psychology has been applied in therapy, particularly in Gestalt therapy, which emphasizes awareness, experience, and the present moment. The goal isn't just to dissect past events, but to understand how patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving form a larger picture. Instead of focusing on isolated incidents, Gestalt therapy encourages people to see how those moments fit into a broader pattern of experience. In problem solving, the Gestalt perspective can help explain moments of insight. Often when we're stuck, it's because we're looking at the problem in pieces. We analyze each part without seeing the bigger structure. But suddenly something clicks. We see the problem in a new way as a whole rather than as parts. This aha moment is central to Gestalt thinking. It reflects a shift in how we organize the information, not a gradual accumulation of small facts. Gestalt psychology also challenges a purely mechanical view of the mind. It suggests that perception is active and interpretive. We are not passive receivers of sensory input. We're active participants in the creation of experience. Our minds shape what we see, often without our awareness. This idea has influenced many areas beyond psychology, including design, education, art, and even artificial intelligence. Designers use Gestalt principles to create layouts that feel intuitive. Educators consider how students form understanding through the organization of information, not just through memorization. Consider how this applies in digital interfaces. When we use apps or websites, we rarely think about why one button feels like it belongs with another, or why certain elements draw our attention. But these experiences are shaped by principles of visual grouping, figure-ground relationships, and patterns that Gestalt psychology describes. Understanding these tendencies allows creators to make systems that align with how our minds naturally work. Another important idea in Gestalt theory is the concept of figure and ground. This refers to how we separate elements of a visual field into the main object, figure, and the background, ground. For instance, when you read text on a page, the words are the figure, and the white background is the ground. But this relationship can shift. In certain images, like the famous vase faces illusion, you can switch between seeing one interpretation and another. The image stays the same, but your perception changes. This shows how perception isn't just about the stimulus, but also about how the mind organizes that stimulus. Gestalt psychology also highlights the limitations of trying to reduce complex experiences to simple parts. For example, in memory research, breaking down a narrative into unrelated facts often leads to poor recall. But if the story has a clear structure, a beginning, middle, and end, people remember it better. The structure provides a framework that helps the brain organize and retain the information. This is why we remember stories more easily than lists, or why a meaningful pattern is easier to recall than a random one. This insight extends to learning and teaching. When we teach in a way that helps learners see connections, patterns, and structures, the learning becomes more meaningful. It's not just about memorizing pieces, it's about understanding how they fit together. Gestalt psychology encourages a shift from analytical, fragmented thinking to holistic, integrated thinking. That doesn't mean ignoring the parts. It means understanding them within context. In communication, this principle is equally relevant. When we speak, the listener doesn't just process individual words. They understand the message based on tone, rhythm, emphasis, and context. The meaning of a sentence isn't always in the words alone. It's in how the words are arranged, what comes before and after, and how they relate to each other. Gestalt psychology reminds us that meaning is a product of structure. Even in emotional experience, Gestalt insights are useful. Emotions don't arise randomly. They emerge from patterns of interpretation. Two people might experience the same event but feel differently about it, depending on how they interpret the context. For instance, someone might interpret a friend's silence as rejection, while another might see it as thoughtfulness. The event is the same, but the meaning, the structure we give it, changes the experience. Gestalt psychology doesn't claim that details don't matter. It recognizes their importance but insists they must be understood as part of something larger. This mindset can change how we solve problems, how we learn, and how we relate to others. It's not about ignoring complexity, but about organizing it in ways that the mind naturally understands. By understanding how we tend to group, simplify, and complete information, we can also become more aware of cognitive biases and errors in perception. Just as we complete shapes visually, we sometimes make assumptions socially or cognitively that aren't supported by evidence. Being aware of these tendencies helps us question initial interpretations and seek broader perspectives. Gestalt psychology provides a reminder that our minds are meaning makers. We don't just react to the world, we organize it. We find form in the formless. This organizing principle applies not only to what we see, but to how we think, how we remember, how we feel, and how we interact with others. And the better we understand this process, the better equipped we are to make sense of our own experiences.